النسق القيمي يعد بمثابة رمز من رموز المجتمع باعتباره الإطار المرجعي الذي يوصل العقل إلى غاياته، لكن هناك من يرى ضرورة ملحة لتبديل واستحداث بعض من هذه القيم في ظل عالم متحول. حياكم الله مشاهدينا إلى هذا الحوار الفلسفي المعرفي البحثي مع دكتور أريانا كونتي، وهي أستاذ مشارك الفلسفة في الجامعة الأمريكية في الشارقة. دكتور كونتي, welcome and thank you very much for being with us on Fujairah TV.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor for me to be here at the conference and with you today.
How would you describe your participation in the Fujairah International Philosophy Conference today?
I'm honored to have been invited to be part of this event, which is really important, momentous, because there are very few philosophy departments in the country. And those departments that we do have, which I think are only one or two, have very few students. And so the role of philosophy has been a little bit neglected in the past. And it is His Highness, the Sheikh of Fujairah, who has understood that the time is ripe and ready today to bring critical thinking and philosophy back to the fore in this country. At this conference, he's invited philosophers from across the world in order to create really an intercultural dialogue and philosophical discussion that is capable from many different perspectives and many different backgrounds of seeking answers to the crisis that we are in, the problems that we face today, from a philosophical perspective.
Based on what you have just mentioned, to what extent do you believe that humanity nowadays need really to revive essential philosophical values?
Yes, I think again the time has come. We are ripe for change, and if you look at the world around us, we can see that the answers on the table, the values on the table are insufficient. Insufficient. What we find is a tendency towards taking for granted certain elements of our world that worked 50 years ago but are no longer working, like infinite growth capitalism, like the degradation of the ecosystem in order to create monetary profit. These things we took for granted, and we can't anymore.
Of course.
And so what we need is philosophers at the forefront in order to think environmentally, politically, socially, in order to find a new way of thinking about ourselves and our relationship to the world that can address the changing world that we find ourselves in. And I think that His Highness here in Fujairah has understood that philosophers have to be at the forefront of the answers to come.
Maybe like a line of defense in face of all these changes and challenges that we're witnessing nowadays. In light of the aristocratic stereotype that imprinted philosophy historically, how can you convince people suffering from all these changes that philosophy can still be the therapy?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think it's going to come from the youth. I'll speak to you as a professor. I've noticed in the classroom, students love philosophy, but they say, but my parents make me be an engineer. Or they, but my parents make me do a degree in management. And so on the one hand, you have a love, and on the other hand, you have a financial necessity. And it's very, very difficult in the world as it is today to bridge that gap. Because I can't say to that student, who cares about money? Study philosophy.
Exactly.
And yet we know that there's very little, we would say in French, débouché. There's very little jobs to be had for philosophers. Yeah, we can teach as professors and do our research. And of course, we have the highest rate in graduate school of any student. Philosophy students are always the best students, as you say. There's an elitism there. So we can get into any program to do any PhD, but convincing students to develop futures as philosophers is difficult precisely because the status quo today does not recompense them for that direction that they could take. And so in terms of that question, it's a very difficult question. We actually need to change the status quo such that we relearn how to appreciate all of the human sciences which are required to find solutions to today's world, and that we encourage students to study those disciplines rather than only to go to business school and study engineering. And that has to come, I think, from engaged and enlightened governments, as we're seeing here in Fujairah and in other parts of the world. There has to be a political impetus, and also from the chancellors of the different universities, in order to make known that values are not going to come from marketing. Values are not going to come, not because we don't need engineers and business people, of course we do, but values are going to come from philosophy. And we have to give the respect to that discipline by creating avenues for our youth in that discipline in order to address the problems of the future.
And now here we come to values in a changing world, which is just really an excellent subject for philosophical inquiry. Dr. Conti, what type of tremendous changes we're witnessing in the 21st century?
Yes, so we could face that question from many different angles. In my research as an environmental philosopher, I'm focusing on this geological change to what is called the Anthropocene age.
Okay, so just sorry to interrupt, just correct me if I'm wrong. The Anthropocene age is a period of time during which human activities have impacted the environment enough to constitute a distinct geological change. Am I accurate?
You are absolutely accurate. And if we think about this shift, we could say it's a natural scientific shift, it's a geological shift, but the truth is it affects every single discipline. It changes the way we look at literature. It changes the way we look at philosophy and anthropology and sociology and political science. Because what it is saying is that a presupposition of modern philosophy that was taken for granted is that there's a difference between nature and culture. And we gave values to culture and not to nature. And now that we have arrived in the Anthropocene age, what we're being told is that everywhere you look, no matter where you look, there is culture that has inflected nature. And everywhere you look in the natural world, nature is inflecting culture. So we can no longer distinguish between the two. Let me give you some silly examples. If you look at a mosquito, you would say that's part of nature. But today, mosquitoes are DEET resistant. And DEET is an insecticide that we apply to the earth in order to kill mosquitoes. So that means there's culture in the mosquito. Or say you make a prayer to the heavens. In the heavens, there is an ozone hole created by our pollution of the atmosphere. So even in the heavens, there is culture. All right, so everywhere we look, at every level, we're going to find that culture and nature have become intertwined. And this transforms what it means to be human and what it means to be non-human. And what we're going to find once we realize that there is culture everywhere is that we need to enlarge our values to include the non-human world. And I think in order to address the Anthropocene and the climate crisis, that's exactly what needs to be done.
Actually, bringing up all these valuable values was supported by deep thinking. But Dr. Conti, how did you develop these values?
I think that what happened in my case is I'm a comparative philosopher, and I became interested in what we call comparative ontology. In other words, looking at the ways different peoples in different parts of the world understand what is. In other words, how they conceive of reality. And so looking at anthropology of different peoples, we can use the work of anthropologist Philippe Descola, who points out that there are 4 world ontologies.
Exactly, and you've mentioned that in your paper.
In my paper, yes.
Exactly.
And so I'm comparing these 4 ontologies, and I'm trying to look at the ways each of these ontologies problematizes nature and culture.
They are the naturalism, totemism, animism, and analogism.
That's exactly right. And so as a scholar specialized in Western philosophy, I'm really seeking to critique Western philosophy. And so I'm using other ontologies to compare them to Western ontology, to show that it's only Western ontology that has separated nature from culture and that has given no value to the natural world. And so I think it is Western culture that needs to change.
Dr. Conti, but we as human beings, how can we think about ourselves and set a new list of life values?
Yeah, that's what philosophy does. Yeah, so we could say we are self-conscious beings, and that means that we have a level that we call the meta level, where not only can we look at the world, we can look at ourselves looking at the world. That's what philosophy does, right? It's called metaphysics. So we have this ability to look at ourselves while being ourselves. We can do both at the same time. Even I'm aware of myself sitting here and speaking to you at the same time as I'm sitting here and speaking to you, as though I were somehow outside myself watching myself. That's what my self-consciousness enables me to do. Mm-hmm. And what this self-consciousness means in philosophy is that we can study our own cultures with as much objectivity as possible through this meta-analysis, mm-hmm. through this ability that we have by being self-conscious beings, so that we can be aware of ourselves and aware of our cultures.
Yeah, actually you have presented 5 new values to contribute towards a new ontology for the Anthropocene age. We're going to go through that after a short break.
Wonderful.
فاصل ونعود. حياكم الله مجددا مشاهدينا إلى هذا الحوار الفلسفي مع دكتور أريان كونتي، وهي أستاذ مشارك الفلسفة في الجامعة الأمريكية في الشارقة. Dr. Aryan, you have presented in your presentation 5 new values to contribute toward a new ontology for the Anthropocene age. We're going to start with them, with the first value now, which says relational instead of intrinsic value.
Yes, thank you. This first value is important because in the modern tradition, ever since we could say Descartes, we've been constituted as what Descartes called a cogito ergo sum, which means je pense donc je suis, I think, therefore I am. And so I'm a thinking thing. And if I'm constituted as a thinking thing, then the entire manifest world around me for Descartes became, he was a mathematician, let's remember that, extension. So the material world is extended, and extension can be measured and calculated, and we still use Cartesian graphs mm-hmm. to exactly. Measure space. And that's all the material world was. It was a mechanical universe constituted by extension. We could say today mass and chemical properties, but only we, to the difference of the rest of the world, were thinking things. And that became a thinking substance. And that created a division between the human soul and the human body, between the human soul and the material world. And just to use Descartes again as an example, Descartes believed that all other animals, because they did not have thought, they did not have feeling and sentience and consciousness. And therefore he believed that you could operate animals with no painkillers because they couldn't feel. Mm-hmm. And famously, when in the hospital they did operate on animals and cut open dogs, for instance, they would cut their vocal cords so that they wouldn't scream in pain mm-hmm. because they were not allowed to feel. Mm-hmm. So today when we hear this story, it's upsetting to us, because not only have we had, the science of ethology to study animal consciousness, but we know very well that animals feel and that animals are aware and conscious, and that this division between thinking souls and the material world must be rethought. And so this first value is seeking to rethink this dichotomy, and it's trying to understand the world in relational terms rather than intrinsic cut aside identity terms. Mm-hmm. And I'm using in particular one of my favorite philosophers, who is a French philosopher named Gilbert Simondon, who speaks about, instead of thinking about ourselves as a fixed substance, a soul substance, we should think of ourselves as individuating, that it's a process in life. We individuate, we mm-hmm. become who we are. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then therefore at birth we begin to look at all of the different influences on us, our parents, our schooling, our cultures, our religions, that aid us in individuating ourselves, and that's never over. We're continuing throughout our lives to individuate, to become. And once you think about ourselves in that way, you can see that immediately relations become essential. And so this first value is simply seeking to focus on this relationality between ourselves and our cultures and our friends and our families and our religions and other beings in the world.
Exactly. The second value you have introduced says ontological boundary crossing instead of selfish genes.
Yes.
Is it related in a way to the first
So
value?
this is the value I discussed today in my talk. It is related. And the idea is simply that, again, in the kind of status quo world we live in, dictated by economics and we going all the way back to Adam Smith, we have this kind of taken for granted idea that we are selfish beings and that we are somehow competitive, selfish beings, and only capitalism reflects our nature. But that idea is actually, from a philosophical point of view, an idea that came about at a particular moment in historical time and as part of a very particular culture. And that is the birth of capitalism in Western culture and the conceptual framework in Adam Smith, for example, that gave us that culture. And so in this second value, I'm trying to look at empathy as studied particularly by neuroscience in order to show that's not at all who we are. We're not selfish, competitive beings, though we can be made to be selfish and competitive. But that's not actually our nature. As herd animals, we are essentially cooperative. And if we look at empathy from a neuroscientific point of view, we see that we have what are called F16 neurons that fire in our brain when we watch someone else perform an action. And the same neurons fire in our brain when we perform the action. And what that means is that we're actually made biologically to identify with others. And that's really what empathy is in my research. So I'm saying that empathy is actually the way we're made. We're made to be empathetic. And other mammals are also made this way. They also have these neurons firing. And therefore, it's actually absolutely natural for me to put myself in your place, to think what it might be like for you to be you, just as I can think what it's like for me to be me. And I would even like to say that not only can I think from your perspective, and that means consider your needs, not just mine, but I can even think from the perspective of a jaguar. And one of my favorite books is called How Forests Think by anthropologist Eduardo Cohn. I think we can think. We can put ourselves in the place even of a forest. And when we do that, then we want to consider what the forest needs. And then we want to consider what the jaguar needs and what you need and what somebody from a vastly different culture from my own needs. And only when we can take into consideration everyone else's needs and values can we actually hope to move towards a world that could be one made of values and not of selfish competition.
Let's move to the third value, which says moral egalitarianism instead of perfectionism. What do you mean by that?
So perfectionism is typical of Western modern philosophy, and it's the philosophy that was developed in order to create a hierarchy of values. And it basically says that we are at the top of this hierarchy because we are rational and self-conscious creatures. And all other animals are less valuable than we are because they're less self-conscious than we are, because they're less rational than we are. And in modern history, they were even considered not conscious at all. I cited Descartes previously, and not sentient at all. So this idea was that we give more value to ourselves and less value to everything else. But we could still see that today we still think of ourselves as vastly superior to all other animal beings. And I think we need to overcome that dichotomy next. So now that we have created equality between all peoples and all genders, we need to work towards understanding the worth of other animals, such that we can live in a world that understands that the thousands of species going extinct every day is a huge problem. We don't want to live alone in the world with no other beautiful creatures, all created by God, to make our world rich. And so I think that can develop an egalitarian ethics where every being has value.
But they are really like perfectionist values. I personally found the fourth value interesting, which says the pluriverse instead of the universe.
Can go back to Kant, for example. And he said that through the use of reason, we can reach a universal that applies to all people. And this gave rise to the United Nations and what we call human rights, okay? And I think that most of us think that human rights are very important in our world today. But if we look at indigenous peoples today who are fighting to save their worlds and their ecosystems from destruction, especially by extractivist companies, what they are saying is we have our own world. And what you call universal doesn't apply to us. And so that as we move towards a post-colonial world, I'm claiming that we need to accept that we live in a world of multiple worlds, not one world, not one Western world. And as we come to accept a world of multiple worlds, we have to accept that each of these worlds has its own truths, and these truths demand our respect. And so my hope is that in order to complete this movement towards post-colonialism, we can accept that we live in a multiverse with many worlds instead of imposing one world on everyone.
The last value focuses on the consequences instead of truth.
Yes.
Why?
That's just connected to the last value. Once you accept the world of multiple worlds and you accept that each of these worlds has its own truths that must be respected, then we can't say, well, my truth is true and your truth is false. Otherwise, we're back in colonialism, right? So if we accept that each world has its own truths and that we can't supersede those truths in terms of our own truths, then we have to find another means of valuing the multiverse. And I'm claiming that the best way to do that is through focusing not on truths, which are different in different worlds, but on consequences, and I mean earthly consequences. So if you destroy a mountaintop to drill for gold, and you destroy an ecosystem with human beings living in it and other beings living in it, that's wrong. Even if one person, the 1%, is making billions by doing it, it's still wrong. Why? Because the consequences of destroying that ecosystem are bad for the earth.
Of course.
So the point is just, we should ask ourselves the question, what are the consequences for the earth? And that should take the place of asking if something is true or false.
Exactly. Got you now. Actually, we need this philosophical vision maybe as an introduction to a future which could redeem the anthropos into the Anthropocene age. Thank you very much, Dr. Conti, for your research, for your vision, for your rich values, and after all, for being with us on Fujairah TV.
It's me who thanks you so much.
Thank you, Doctor. مشاهدينا، أصبحت الإنسانية اليوم في وضع المستدان من الطبيعة، وخلقت لنفسها علاقة معقدة مع هذه الأخيرة. الكثير من الرهانات، بعضها فلسفي والبعض الآخر أخلاقي، لبلورة منظومة تطبيقية تقي الإنسان شر ما اقترفت يده. دمتم بخير.